Okay. Today, we have someone who has not spoken at the class before. His name is Ricky Gill, and he is right here. And he is a candidate for Congress. How about that? Okay. The 9th district, which is, what's the seat, what's the base of this? Stockton. Okay, just over the, east. It's where he grew up out there. What's interesting about him, aside from the fact that he is a candidate for Congress, he is currently a law student right here at Cal. So the idea of a young person, a Cal person, running for Congress, I think that's awesome. And do some of you. Prior to coming to Bolt, he studied at Princeton, unlike any of you, because none of you got in. He was at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. And he's going to be graduating from Bolt in May, and the election is on this year. This seat that he's running for, what's interesting about it, it was held by a Republican for a long time, then a Democrat won about 6 years ago. Is that correct? But is still considered a swing district. Very, very few districts are truly swing districts, especially in California, where it's been gerrymandered so much that they're almost all safe seats. It's very rare that we have a seat turnover. So this might be a real race. And so those of you who hear Ricky speak today are interested, this could be a race to get involved in. Please welcome Ricky Gill.
No? Okay, we're going to try that.
Wait, now it is.
How about now? Good? You got me? Great. Professor Ross, thanks for the introduction. We actually have a professor at the law school called Berkeley Ross who doesn't resemble you at all, but you're both kind-hearted individuals and appreciate the introduction. It's great to be here, and I appreciate, frankly, any audience of this size, but particularly on the Berkeley campus. I know you've got better places to be than Professor Ross's class, so thanks for showing up. It's really fantastic to be here. This, as you know, is the most esteemed public university in the world, and thanks, Buck. This is our campaign comes with some theater, as you're about to find out, but we really appreciate being here. And there's a lot at stake, but you ought to be very proud of yourselves. You're at the most esteemed public university in the world, and I think we obviously share this campus, but we also share a generation, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about in politics. There's a lot in our society that affects young people of both parties. There's frankly no monopoly on good ideas, and that's something I'd like to pitch you on today. I'm more in my Cal colors today, if you didn't notice that allegiance, but it's really fantastic to be here. And I'd like to tell you, this is admittedly a young campaign team. You just saw Buck here. Buck's in his mid-20s, and I'm in my mid-20s. As you know, the constitutional age requirement for Congress is 25. So we're pushing the age envelope. That's not the only boundary we're pushing. A lot of novelty in this race. But I'd like to talk to you about my first-generation American story, the generation we share as young people, and why this race might matter to you. I'd like to start initially with a question, though. Is there anyone in this audience who's from the Central Valley? Great. Terrific. You're now my favorite people in the room. So I'm running for Congress largely in the Central Valley. As Professor Ross alluded to, we have whole new congressional districts. Every 10 years, we redraw the lines, and we have a special opportunity in that district. There's a lot of hardship there, a lot of economic pain, but I think the political system has a part to play in fixing those problems. Let me tell you about that district. It's centered in Stockton. We call it the 209. If any of you saw Dallas Braden, who threw a perfect game for the Oakland A's, there you go. I worked for the A's, by the way, as a Giants fan, so I played both sides. Anyhow, Dallas Braden's from Stockton. We've got some of those local athletic heroes. Dallas actually has 209, the area code tattooed on his stomach. So there's a lot of pride in that community. Great folks are from there. That's where I'm born and raised. The district is largely Stockton, Lodi, Brentwood. Not for you folks in LA, not the wealthy Brentwood. We have another Brentwood where we grow sweet corn. That's the district. And in that district today, there is enormous economic pain. There is a double the national unemployment rate. The foreclosure situation is egregious, it's bad, it's difficult. There's a lot of pain. Young people in your age demographic don't come back to that district. There's just no economic opportunity. I hear so many heartbreaking stories from young people who say, Double trouble, we beat you. I hear stories all the time about young people who say, Ricky, I'm not sure I should persist in high school till I get my diploma because I have to supplement my father's income. That's the kind of pain that exists. There's no new job creation happening. Young people don't come back. The young people who come to great universities like Berkeley, UCLA, Stanford, they don't come back. And that's, I think, a seminal failure economically. But there's a political problem, too. And I think as young as this campaign team is, we are fighting for something that is arguably the most venerable, oldest, wisest principle in our form of government, which is self-representation. That's why this country was formed. I mean, think about it. There's nothing novel about that. That is why the American spirit is what it is politically. It's because we have the right to determine what free and fair elections look like, who represents us. And in that district, the most sobering statistic might not be the economics. It's the politics. There is not a single state or federal legislator who lives in the district where I'm running. Not one. You think about that for a second. In a community that is twice the national unemployment rate, where people are feeling dire straits, there's no one in Sacramento and no one in Washington who actually is sensitive to our needs, including my opponent. My opponent is the sitting Democratic congressman. He's been there for 6 years, and he's part and parcel of this failure. I want to get back to redistricting because I think it's probably the most egregious example of my opponent's action. There are things he hasn't done, and then there are things he's done. And the latter I object to, largely. In California, we had a redistricting process that was supposed to prevent politicians from drawing their lines. Do you remember this? And maybe you guys can give me a nod of your heads if you remember the redistricting commission. The point was to take self-interest out, right? Politicians should be hands-off. No matter if you're a Republican or a Democratic congressman, you should let the citizens draw their districts, right? Very fair, eminently fair. Well, my opponent seemed to have gotten caught with his hand in the cookie jar. And we just found this out. And this is not from a publication that's friendly to Republicans. This is a ostensibly neutral publication, ProPublica, that 2 days before Christmas handed down a bit of a Christmas present, if you will. They indicated that my opponent paid a lobbyist $20,000 to subvert the redistricting effort in this state. Again, manipulating the boundaries of a district where he still doesn't live today. And I think, local representation matters because my opponent just doesn't live down the road. There's some politicians who live 2 miles outside of their district. He lives 70 miles outside of this district and still seems to be reluctant to move. I mean, people there feel like we're his second choice. But it's not just living outside. I think that's a metaphor for being out of touch. And you don't want to thrive on the negative, but the point is he's created an opportunity for someone in our generation to actually lead. On a whole host of things. Our biggest industry there is agriculture. I learned the value of a dollar through the prism of my family small business. My parents immigrated to this country. We grow grapes, and actually wine grapes if you're interested in wine. Some of you might not be at the legal limit yet, so forget if I said that. But we grow wine grapes and cherries. That's where I learned the value of a dollar, is in a small business. And we should talk about regulations, and those are all very big issues. But my opponent has systematically voted against the one industry we have, agriculture. I think about new and emerging industries in the Silicon Valley. Many of you may want to work in the Silicon Valley. I wouldn't be surprised if you did. Well, we don't have any of that high-tech investment in that district, and that's something I'm focused on. So there are a host of issues, and there's a vacuum of leadership on his part. I think about foreclosures. You have people getting kicked out of their home, and the best my opponent could do for 5 years was hold a workshop one weekend on foreclosures. Over 5 years, think about that. Or on small business. That's how we create jobs in this economy. Well, he had a small business panel that met only once over 5 years. I think that's a statement of just not following through. So that's a little bit about his shortcomings, but you are obviously wondering internally, how is this going to work and what are you going to offer? Because I think leadership choices and elections are about a contrast. Well, I want you to know that this campaign can be fundamentally different and a lot more exciting. It already has been. This can be the campaign that talks the language of fairness actually from a Republican point of view. You might not hear about equity from Republicans a lot, but you do in my campaign. We talk about equity in terms of charter schools, making sure that student-centered education reform happens. You mentioned, Professor Ross, that Arnold Schwarzenegger had spoken here, and one part of my background is that I served on the State Board of Education 7 years ago. And I'll never forget when Arnold Schwarzenegger called up. I'm a pretty skinny guy now, but I was really skinny back then. And he said, I'd like you to represent 6.3 million public school students on the State Board of Education. California's always been on the cutting edge, and that's a role we have, is for a high school student to represent students. You think about it, every other interest group in education has a lobby, but students don't. So we fought for that. I'm fighting for more charter school philanthropy in my district. I'm fighting for more high-tech investment. But I think this campaign can talk about fairness on the debt. And that's probably what concerns you the most. We're spending our way into oblivion in this country, and ultimately, you're going to have to pay for it. The generations of taxpayers who are unborn are going to have to pay for this. That's why I've advocated for a balanced budget requirement, which more than 40 states have, but we don't have at the federal level. And I think that's beyond me. So, without further ado, I think questions are very important. I hope you guys are at least itching to ask a question. What I want you to know, though, is there's a bigger picture for this campaign. It is our generation. It is local representation. And it is about making sure our state, is home to two competitive political parties. Right now, I think California is becoming increasingly a one-party state. And I think you look at emerging countries around the world, two parties, at least a multi-party democracy that fully functions, is a recipe for stability. And we really don't have that in California. It's becoming a one-party state, and I think the competition of ideas suffers. So in races like mine and around the state, I think you're going to see a revival of two parties competing for people's hearts and minds, and I think that's how it's supposed to be. My opponent is going to make a lot of my age. I've already revealed to you that I'm turning 25. And I can give you a birth certificate if you need it, right? That seems to be a question. For me, it's not where I'm born, it's when. But, I think young people should not be deterred from making a difference in their community. It's part of the Berkeley mission. I can't quote it verbatim, but it's part of the spirit of this school to reach out, to go beyond, the town-gown dichotomy and really engage the community. I think that's incredibly admirable. And young people do have a role to play. We talked about the debt. The job situation in this country, unless it's fixed, is going to affect your prospects coming out of college. Even though this is a great university, we need the overall economy to be in balance for you folks to be doing well. So there's a lot at stake. I often say in this election, and I'm going to drag you back into history, there's a Benjamin Disraeli moment. Now, you guys might be yawning on me, but if I can take you back to the 19th century, Professor Ross, you probably have read this. That's why, a lot of people say I feel like a 50-year-old in a 25-year-old body, and that might not be inaccurate. But Disraeli was a pioneering British prime minister, and when he got elected, or right before his election, obviously they have a parliamentary system, but when he got elected, the notion was, is there really a competitive two-party system in Britain, because the Labour Party was preeminent and the Tories were really in decline? Well, Disraeli broadened the appeal of the Tory party so that at least there was a functioning two-party society. And I think, with redistricting, we have these competitive swing districts. The onus is on the Republican Party to go out and reach these new demographic categories. I'm an Asian American. My mother and father immigrated they have a roundabout story. My father grew up in Africa. My mother and father are born in India. And my father went to school in Europe. And we've been in the San Joaquin Valley now for 40 years. And that's a different journey, fundamentally, than my opponent, who's there to run an election and never had these so-called constituents as his neighbors. So I just wanted to give you a primer on the race. That's it in a nutshell. I'm standing up for your generation if you didn't know it. I might not be in your district, although what is quirky is that the old 9th Congressional District was here. And the new 9th Congressional District has swung over there. So I feel like I took it with me, but I wasn't responsible for that. But I'd be happy to take your questions now. And Professor Ross, if that's fine with you. Thank you.
Anything about running for office, Stanford issues, all the way in the back.
Yeah, well, look, there are historically low interest rates, which you're aware of. The biggest difficulty I see when I talk to neighbors back there and community members is they can't even get a hold of their bank. A lot of these folks have underwater mortgages. They can't even contact their bank, let alone begin in earnest the process of a renegotiation. So, we got to facilitate that process. There has to be There are community initiatives that are happening on the ground, which are organic. There's one actually in Antioch, which I'd point you to, where a lot of folks who have faced foreclosure actually they're put in rental situations, then eventually can graduate back to home ownership and eventually reclaim the homes that they once lost. The bottom line is we need to be doing more, and I think I point to that as an exhibit of no follow-through.
I'm curious, historically, what age is the youngest person ever elected to Congress?
So there are individuals who were 24 at the time of their election and then turned 25 in the period between the election and their investiture. So I can't say we'd be the youngest, but we're certainly on the edge.
Yeah. All right, more questions right here.
Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. So, look, I'm a proponent of both. I think we need to diversify this economy, but we have to protect our agriculture heritage. When I mentioned my opponent voting against agriculture, he voted against trade, which is a seminal, advocacy thing for farmers. Farmers want to export their products. We grow walnuts, cherries, grapes, asparagus in that district. The more markets that we have, the better we are in terms of economic activity. My opponent was one of the few members of Congress in this entire country to represent partly a rural district who voted against free trade agreements. And by the way, that's not a Republican issue. President Obama and House Republicans agreed that that was a wise policy initiative. I know it's rare to find that agreement, but that's the kind of compromise that I'd push for. You had Barack Obama and John Boehner saying that this should have been pushed through. It was great for farmers. Because my opponent doesn't really know that, community voted against it. In terms of diversifying the economy, it's very important. From President Ronald Reagan's era to today, all net job creation can be attributed to high-growth startups, and we don't have that startup activity in that community. You have it down the peninsula, we don't there. It starts with education reform, but there are other things we can do, too. I'm a big proponent of skilled immigration reform, which not all Republicans are. I am, and it's because on campuses like this, we have educated folks coming from foreign countries. We got to keep them here and retain that talent.
Can you explain that a little more when you say skilled immigration?
Yeah, so there are a variety of proposals that were in Congress at one time. I'm not sure about the current status, but if you're getting a graduate degree in a STEM field, science, technology, engineering, medicine, mathematics, you should be the simple notion, and this is something Michael Bloomberg is a big advocate for. In fact, he calls it national suicide not to have a skilled immigration policy that works. But we should almost be stapling green cards to these individuals' diplomas. They're graduating from schools like Berkeley and Stanford, and yet we make it very difficult for them to stay here. That's a brain drain that we can't really tolerate as a society. And I think there's a reflex reaction in our society. When some people talk about this, they say, well, those folks are probably taking jobs away. That's not my view. My view is that they're going to create a new generation of jobs which we desperately need in a place like Stockton.
Right here.
To what programs? Yeah. Sure. So the student's asking about TRIO programs and how can you encourage young people to, be on a pathway to higher education. Well, there are a couple of things. Not all leadership at a congressional level is formal, and most politicians won't tell you this, but it's really the truth. Part of leadership is just having a platform to raise awareness on important issues. So, leading by example is one way to help. Another. A firm conviction that I have, though, is that education is the last thing we should be cutting. There's no doubt that we're in an austerity era, meaning we have to do more with less, right? We just have to. We have to push the dollar further. But I just think cutting education is something that, that I'm against, and we should not do unless it's a last resort. But we should possibly talk afterwards. I'd like to get your thoughts, too. Yeah, right here. Gray sweatshirt, right? Go ahead. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I've given public statements about this before. I mean, I mentioned I would have reluctantly voted for the debt deal, and let me explain that. That debt was already accrued. The decision to spend that money, those outlays had already happened, and I think national default is a catastrophic thing. The other thing is the super committee that was hailed and held up as an example of reform. I had reservations about that, and I wasn't sure it was going to work out, and in true to form, it didn't. You know, we kind of kicked the can down the road, so that was my reluctance. We need to tie the hands of Congress so that we don't continue to have this debacle year in and year out. We now have debt that is the size of our economy. We've never really had that as a country before, and that's pretty perilous. Yeah. You're referring to the Americans for Tax Reform? Yeah, but I've signed that pledge as of July. Nice. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. It's very similar to Stockton. Thanks. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great question. And nice Giants sweatshirt, by the way. Well, I think there are a couple of things I'd advocate. Some of them are standard issue items. Others aren't. I think regulations are important. Here's something I have advocated for in terms of regulatory review. And to put it in an academic frame, when the economy goes up or the economy goes down, for a long time we've had counter-cyclical fiscal policy. We've had counter-cyclical monetary policy. We in this country have never had a counter-cyclical regulatory policy, meaning when the economy is down, we shouldn't continue to add red tape on entrepreneurs' backs, which can hinder job creation, right? I think that should also fluctuate with the economy. I think we need to cut the red tape. The way we can do that is by shifting the default. Every major federal rule in Congress, every major federal rule should be submitted to Congress for an up or down vote. That's not how it works today. More laws are made in Washington through regulation than Congress voting, and that's affecting manufacturing. Education is actually a part of this. Germany has managed to retain manufacturing jobs, and it's partly tied to their rigorous vocational training, so we need to take some cues from abroad. They are doing something right, and that's something we can learn from. And then there's a very important issue that's lingered for a long time called repatriation. There's so many corporate profits that are parked overseas, and we as Americans, we would like to benefit from that repatriation, bringing those taxes home. One thing I'd like to advocate is for specific regions that are hard hit, like Modesto or Stockton, if companies bring those taxes back and repatriate those profits, they should be taxed at a lower rate so that we induce economic activity where we badly need it. And that's a way of stimulating the economy without putting more people on the government payroll, right? One approach was the stimulus, which frankly did not work in our community. The economy frankly got worse over the last 2.5 years in a place like Stockton and Lodi. It didn't get better. The unemployment rate there is twice what it is around the entire state. And then you saw the expenditures that were given to companies like Solyndra. That was a federal loan guarantee that went nowhere, and you're on the hook for that. So I think that's what happens when government intervention goes too far. Repatriation is a way to grow the economy without putting politicians in a position where they're picking winners or losers. I just don't think human motivation works that well in that scenario.
In the back,
I can't see the question. Where are you? You put your hand up? Okay. No. I haven't made a decision. Actually, I was just with someone who was campaigning for me. Was the former governor of Florida, Jeb Bush. He actually flew across the country, and he helped me out. And like him, I'm still in a wait and see mode.
I think it's over.
That's it.
No, none of the class is over, but I think the election.
Oh, the election.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
After Florida, I don't think it's going to be much of a campaign. Go ahead.
Oh.
You're back, yeah.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Great question. Funding is actually, it's an obstacle for most challengers. We happen to be doing pretty well on that metric. We actually have more money in the bank than my opponent. We've raised close to $1 million, actually, in this race. And we announced in May. And the reason we've done that, and it's something that's very humbling, it's because people in that district want a representative who's grounded there. You hear a lot about outsourcing. We've outsourced our congressman for 6 years, and that's an indignity. So the thing you have to understand, though, is as a challenger, you raise all your funds from individuals. So these are farmers and doctors and small business people, truckers. And so, the playing field's not exactly level. My opponent raises a lot of money from political action committees. That's code word for special interests, right? And they control the system, and that's why there is so much gridlock. The other thing is my opponent cannot seem to raise much money at all from the Central Valley. He raises all his money outside of the district. And so I think that's not exactly a good proxy measure for how successful you're going to be. If you can't raise money in the district, how are you going to fare there? Campaign finance is interesting. I will tell you, the way the laws are structured now, candidates do spend a lot of time raising money. And it's because we have these individual limits, you can only give so much. It puts a premium on raising money from a lot of different donors. And cultivating that kind of base takes a long time. So there are definitely trade-offs. But it's an interesting conversation that's happening. And it's, as you know, the courts are playing a role too. Nice. Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, I think welfare reform was a kind of critical chapter in our country's history 15 years ago. It still is an important conversation to have. That's an example, by the way, of a bipartisan agreement, right? For all this talk that we can't do things across party lines, I give you two examples. Free trade, which just happened last year between President Obama and House Republicans, which my opponent disagreed with, and welfare reform. So you're right to bring it up. I think we need to still encourage people to move from welfare to work. And the way we can do that is, I think it's very important. Coming from the Central Valley, we all have this tinge of compassion because we see the heartache. I've actually never seen poverty so up close and personal in Stockton or Lodi as I have in the last 2 years. Yeah, as you know, it's just a symptom of the bad economy. So, in terms of specific proposals, there are things that we can do. I mean, rewarding people for, which they're doing in Georgia, by the way. They're rewarding people for apprenticeships and sort of accruing skills, because the biggest problem in our economy, which no one talks about, is the skills mismatch. You have a vacancy, and you have a lot of people who want that vacancy. They want to fill that job, but they don't have the skills. Their skills have rusted away. So rewarding people when they're in that 99-week period to go get an apprenticeship is probably one thing we can do. It's still something that, I'm fleshing out, though. Can you be specific about that? Creating programs? No, I think just to clarify, what I was referencing was the foreclosure issue is the biggest thing back home, right? And the best thing he could do was convene a workshop on a given day, which is grossly inadequate. You could consider it negligence. Or on small business, to convene a panel on small business and then to really never have it meet again, or to say, which he did to these small business panel members, that what they might as well do is tell him how they should be spending federal pork money, is a degradation of the office of U.S. Congressman. And so that was my point. My point was not to create a program. Fiscal responsibility is a big theme of this campaign. Yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Well, look, the fact is the current regime isn't working when we have trillions of dollars in corporate profits that are overseas, and we're taxing, by the way, corporate tax at the second highest rate in the Western world. So that arguably the status quo is what needs to change. And I think, I'm not sure about the 2004 repatriation statistics. I don't want to base my answer off that. What I would tell you is in hard-hit areas, and we had this conversation earlier, I know there was a question, if we can adjust tax rates and condition that upon investment in certain areas, it's a way of creating a workforce that's not on the federal payroll. Yeah. Yeah, my stance on this issue is I'm a supporter of traditional marriage, but I do believe in civil unions, and it's a way to obviously confer respect on a very meaningful relationship. Yeah, up here. Great question. I mean, yeah, so his question is, how do you intend to break gridlock in Washington? I would just say, and I do believe that what got this country on the fiscal precipice that we're on is not a revenue crisis. I do believe that spending, the way you define spending decreases in Washington is not an absolute decrease. Most Americans don't know this. Spending decreases are defined as lessening the rate of the increase. Now, even having that conversation is important. There's historical value in this, too. When Ronald Reagan was president on national defense, he was the first president to negotiate an absolute reduction in nuclear arms. Before, all the decreases were arresting the rate of the increase. So, reframing the debate is important. That often gets lost in the shuffle. Compromise is very critical, though. I told you about, I mentioned earlier, how President Obama and House Republicans agreed on free trade, which would have been the best thing for my district. It would have been, we grow about $2.2 to $2.3 billion in ag products every year. Those foreign markets would have been a big boon for us. That's an example of working together. Another one is regulatory reform. President Obama wrote an op-ed last year about reviewing federal regulations. I would be providing momentum behind that. So there are definitely a series of things to consider, but on taxes, that's my stand. Mm-hmm. Well, we have a great community college in the district where I'm running. It's called San Joaquin Delta College. In fact, one of the trustees there is a good friend of mine. He supported me from day one. Well, I think community colleges are vitally important, particularly in districts like that. We actually, in Stockton is one of the biggest municipal areas in the entire country that is pretty much separated from a public four-year university. And that's remarkable. The closest public university we have is CSU Stanislaus. We've got some friends from Modesto in the audience, but they seem to have taken that away. Look, Delta College is important. I think creating partnerships with businesses that are hiring is a way to leverage certain institutions in that district. I think they are very important. They provide a safety net for adults who are trying to acquire skills. So, I would consider myself very friendly to the community college system. I also think there are four-year universities that are private that can make a difference in that district too. University of the Pacific is a great example. I'm actually working with them, or intend to begin working with them, on a literacy initiative in the city of Stockton. They have an education school, and what I'd like to see happen is the best practices from the charter school movement taken from charters that are working, and use that to augment charter schools that aren't working. We have great resources in that district, but it takes leadership. This race is about more than just experience, it's about leadership. And I think that's where my opponents failed and fallen short. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm certainly happy to answer that question. I'm a Sikh American. That's the faith of my fathers. But Sikhism informs my level of tolerance, respect, and appreciation for other faiths. And I actually went to Catholic and Christian schools growing up. Yeah. Well, I think we're already doing it, to be honest. By being able to break bread with a lot of different people. I speak Spanish. I am a first-generation American, and being able to know that there are barriers in our society, some of which are artificial, that we can get beyond, that's an important recognition for someone in public service to have. It's important to, be able to identify with people. Small business owners aren't from one segment of society. They're all of us. Students come from all backgrounds, but they care about the same things. A patient, no matter what your last name is, cares about quality access to a physician. A small business owner not only wants to make ends meet, but they fear frivolous litigation. So, and no matter who you are, you want to leave a better America for your children. And you want a political system that works. And I think we're fighting for that. We're fighting for, as I mentioned, I don't want to harp on this, but we're fighting to make sure a district actually has a congressman who's from there, who knows that community. And if that chain and accountability is broken, everything else can fall by the wayside. So I would argue and submit to you that that's the most fundamental precept in politics today.
Back row.
Can you raise your hand? I can't see you. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, listen, I think we can all be very sensible stewards of the environment. I mean, I told you I do come from a farming family, and I'll tell you, we do more to keep land green in that district than a lot of people do. So conservation is valuable. Where I think I differ with my opponent is the role of government in actively benefiting people who are, paying to play. And so, when there are these subsidies that are given out to companies that ultimately will crater, I think there's a problem that most Americans have. And you see that with a company like Solyndra. I mean, we can be sensible stewards of the environment. We need to be cognizant of the economic impact. Because without a job, no one can really enjoy the environment either. It does work both ways.
The blue shirt. The blue? Yeah. No, that's not your green. The other guy. Yeah. Blue. Green. Yeah. Yeah, go. Draft candidates who speak the American language. Figuratively, literally.
Being able to do outreach is important. We're doing it in this campaign. You know, there was a lonely Saturday afternoon. It was July of 2011. I was handing out scholarships at Filipino Plaza in downtown Stockton. Taking the road less traveled is what the Republican Party has to do. And I'd like to create, you know, in this race, I think we are part and parcel of that template. Yeah. Can you ask I didn't get that second question. I'm personally pro-life. That's a conviction I have. I do believe in the Hyde Amendment, which is a federal restriction on funding the practice, but the rest should be left to the courts, and we'll see how that jurisprudence shapes up. Well, I'll tell you, the seminal failure of the recent federal health overhaul was that there were no costs that were contained. In the last year and a half, you've seen premiums spike through the roof in California. And the thing that's punitive for small business owners and for individuals is having healthcare premiums go up. No matter who you are or what your background is, that hurts. There was no cost containment. So we broadened access, but we didn't do anything to bend the cost curve. That's a problem. So I'm an advocate for tort reform. I'm an advocate to leverage the consumer. I think we should be able to buy insurance across state lines. I mean, you can buy anything else in America across state lines, except for wine, I think, and health insurance. And that's a problem. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we should have a broader conversation about energy writ large. You know, and the thing we need in this country, finally, is a patriotic energy policy. When a country like Canada comes to us and essentially is conferring a benefit upon us, like Professor Ross did when he invited me to speak here today, we should accept, not only as a matter of national security and building an amicable relationship with Canada, but they essentially were conferring a natural resource upon us. And the special interest lobby in Washington, D.C. said no. And so we didn't build that pipeline. It would have created jobs. I think we need an all-hands-on-deck strategy with energy. I do believe in renewables. But the renewable process should not come at the expense of political integrity. And so when you have these subsidies given out to companies that are keeping the taxpayer on the hook for $500 million, I think that offends people's sensibilities. But we can still appreciate what works, and that's wind, that's geothermal, and but let's give the market a chance to operate. Yeah. Well, you know, it's an interesting conversation to have. I would say in its first form, which I think was 2010, maybe 2011. I don't know when it was introduced. I had reservations about that because I thought the bar was too low, and so you know I think there needs to be a willingness still in our society though to look to individuals who do warrant a shift in status. I think it's a conversation to have. As a country, I'm glad we're finally having it. I haven't seen a current form that I would support. Mm-hmm. Do you want to repeat that? Okay. How can we compete given that they pay a subsistence wage? Well, we can compete in terms of quality. I mean, I still think made in USA counts for something. And if we can leverage that in terms of a better brand identity, China has also slipped up on their manufacturing in a couple of instances where, there have been public health implications. So I think there's no doubt that we have the best brand in the world. If we can, adjust our cost structure in a way that still allows us to have meaningful output, that's what we should do. We do have a comparative advantage, though, and that's made in USA. As long as we can make ourselves reasonably competitive, I think there is a better future for American manufacturing.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank
Great.
you so much.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks so much.